Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Rich from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gorn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 24 in my 50 most relevant for 2025. It is the players that I believe we have to have a conversation about this pre-season before you go and lock your side away. Whether you're listening to this in January or it's a last-minute cram before round one gets underway, we are so glad to have you back on the podcast, tuning in on this episode about Tim Taranto. Just 12 months ago, he was an absolute midfield star. 24 months ago, he loomed as one of the best forwards for us. And now, a little bit forgotten in the SuperCoach community, it's safe to be said. While AFL fantasy coaches are either bullish or petrified about what this year may hold. It all depends on whether you're on or off Tim Taranto this year. We are going to talk about that on today's episode of the 50 Most Relevant. Joining me, it's a man that if you've been on the social media platform of X, you've probably seen him posting some form of statistical data points. He's really, from an AFL fantasy perspective, been a key pioneer in our understanding of market share and taking some NFL fantasy ideologies and bringing that into the AFL fantasy landscape. It's so good to be able to chat to him on this podcast. He's a part of the AFL fantasy marketplace. It is Rowan. Hello, mate. Nice to see you. Nice to hear from you. Timmy Taranto. Gosh, this could be a fun conversation to have.
Oh, look, love Timmy Taranto. I think AFL fantasy coaches for ages have loved Tim Taranto. We look to him a lot as just one of those. He's a ball getter. He loves the ball. He knows where it is. But there is plenty of question marks that we need to discuss here. Whether it's his team, whether who is he competing against on his team, and we've seen the massive change at Richmond. I'm excited to talk Tim. So yeah, thanks for having me on, MJ. It's great to be here.
Mate, pleasure to have you on for your debut episode of the Coaches Panel, and I'm pretty sure it won't be the last time you see him throughout the preseason or season proper of 2025. A seasonal average last year in basically almost identical across the formats. It's a 95.5 in Fantasy and Dream Team, a 94.5 in SuperCoach. It means in those two formats, he's not cheap, but he's not as pricey as he might have been 12 months ago. Just over the $500,000 mark in SuperCoach. Just under $1 million in AFL Fantasy, in at $980K. Well, it's going to set you back $967,700 in Dream Team. Just the 15 games last year. We'll talk about that, I am sure. Well, last year, a season high score in AFL Fantasy of 145 against the Gold Coast Suns. That was right towards the back of the year. So let's not be thinking, he's an early season thriver. No, even when the Exodus was on, and the kids were coming through, he was still scoring. His career best scores, though, you got to go back to 2019 in fantasy when he was a Giant. He gave you a 156 against North Melbourne. While in SuperCoach, 139 against the Hawks was his season high score, but a 147 against Port Adelaide just the season prior in 2023. So not too bad from a guy that not too many give a lot of respect to. And even against a hard-scoring team like Port Adelaide, they've been the past couple of years, he's still getting it done. Ron, we probably don't need to spend a heap of time, and we do need to go into the 2024 season, but we don't need to help the fantasy footy community understand who he is and how he is as a type of player, because if you've been playing over the last 2 seasons, then chances are you had Tim Taranto when he was forward eligible for you in 2023, or even looked at him last year in 2024. He's almost the prototype AFL fantasy midfielder, isn't he? Where high accumulator, big body. When he goes forward, he can take a mark, he can kick a goal, but his disposal efficiency is never so amazing that he becomes the target, meaning if he wants to get 40 possessions, opposition teams are like, well, he won't cut us up with that. SuperCoach, it hurts a little bit, sure, but for AFL fantasy, pound for pound, he is almost the prototype mid you want, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. Like, he knows where the ball is. He's going to go get it. He's just always going to go get it. He's hard-nosed for it, which is fantastic. And yeah, that's right. In AFL fantasy, you don't care. You don't care where the ball goes after that. It's really what you want to hold on to is he getting the kicks? Is he getting the handballs? Is he around the contest? Is he tackling hard for it? Is he sneaking up forward for a sneaky goal? And he loves that. He does that quite a bit actually, which is fantastic. So yeah, he sits in that range of outcomes in terms of like great midfielders. As he's got the chops for to be a phenomenal AFL fantasy mid. We saw that back in 2023, that first half of the season, where he went for over 120, averaged 120 for the first, into the bye, essentially.
Yeah. After
the bye, had that kind of bit of a downfall. But essentially, he's riding that high in Richmond which were, they were starting to fall down, right, in 2023. The legs were falling off a little bit, And so then, obviously, you get to this year just gone, last year, and it falls again. And you see his average go down, 95.5 for the year. And yeah, it's interesting to think, because he was injured. There was a big gap there between rounds 5 to 12 where he wasn't playing last year. Injury affected again in round 18 to 20. Is that actually, is last year indicative of what he can actually do? And I'm not sure, but with injury, right? It's, we're fantasy coaches. We're looking for injuries. We're looking for the opportunity to go, this isn't actually him. And I think there's an element of Tim Taranto we go, this isn't actually him. The 95.5, that's not actually him. We want so desperately for that first half of 2023 to be the real Tim Taranto. So, yeah, we could put a bit of a line through 2024 and say, yeah, it's not the real him. But the reality is he's part of a team that was in dire straits, has gone to the draft and tried hard to kind of push themselves and rebuild themselves. So it's really a lot of question marks in terms of what the team's going to be like. And what's Taranto's role in that? Well, he looks like the number one.
And I think if he becomes that, and there's some questions I want to ask you around the Tigers, the game style, market share, let alone this historical data trend we've got now of over a decade of good fantasy players in historically bad teams or rebuilding teams is probably a nicer terminology to say. I want to ask you all those elements, but 3 120-plus scores across the format last year. As I said, almost an identical average, 95.5 in fantasy, 94.5 in SuperCoach. Just the 6 tons last year in fantasy. There's a couple of injury-impacted games that, Rowan, you've alluded to, and then the 8 tons in SuperCoach. But he just fell away in almost every potential scoring column. His kicks had a decrease. His handballs had a decrease. His tackles had a decrease. His marks had a decrease. His goals had a decrease. His centre bounce attendance had a decrease. His time on ground fell away. His points per minute fell away. Almost outside of his disposal efficiency, everything went worse for Tim Taranto. But we look at that 2023, and is he more the 24 guy, or is he more the 23 where he goes 112 for the season in fantasy, 17 tons, 9 of those converted into 120s, a 106.7 in SuperCoach, 13 tons, 5 over 120. And you mentioned that mid-season buy, 124.7 in fantasy and nothing under 108, while SuperCoach, you think he might not be a SuperCoacher, right? And maybe you're a SuperCoach going, hang on, Rowan, hang on, MJ, I'm going to skip to the next episode. Taranto's not on the list. Midway through 2023, he's gone 119.4 and he had nothing under 90. You tell me you don't want a piece of that, paying a 94.5? Friend, you're missing a trick if you're not at least considering Tim Taranto. So I got to ask one key question to you, Rowan. You're one of the best data guys in fantasy footy. What the heck was the cause of that score fall? Is it just simply he got injured in a couple of games and that is it? Or is there something a little bit more underneath the surface we need to look at?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think injury always plays a part. But when I look at what was happening in that team, there's a lot of question marks going around. And I like to look at team fantasy points. I like to look at how many points they're getting each game and what that averages out to and all that kind of stuff. So when I look at last year and I look at Richmond, they fell in points per game by 100 points per game. They went from 1,495 points, so just under 1,500 per game, which sat them at 14th they're already pretty poor, and they've always been that. Like, if you think of Dimmer and the way that he's coached that team, they've always been like under league level in terms of team points per game. But when I look at that massive drop from 2023 to 2024, going down 100 points every game, like, that's one of the most drastic losses of points per game that we've seen in the last 10 years from year to year for a team. And so what happens within that? Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. We saw the talent fall off. We saw the talent pool get really short for Richmond. Like, there's an element of having to look at this and go, okay, they're just getting smashed. Yeah. And what that means is opportunity for all the players across the team. It's falling. We saw it with Jaden Short. You see it with all these guys who fell under their averages from the last few years because as a team they weren't playing well. And so while Tim Taranto, obviously, we loved him to elevate above that. You want him to be the guy that can, be the number one. And he is still. There's some stats here that point to him being absolutely number one player on their team. You can't overcome the tsunami of when your whole team is just performing in such a way. So I think that explains that. I think there's multifaceted reasons for that, and people, documented that, talked about that a lot in terms of Richmond and dissecting it. But just in terms of that holistic point of view, like, I think it's pretty easy to see why Tim Taranto fell down. Yes, injury, but also just the whole team was struggling. It was just struggle town for the whole year.
In a few minutes, I do want to ask you about what this midfield mix might look like. And remember, Tim's got the capacity to go forward and play forward, but we want to ask about how they're going to rebuild in a moment. We'll look at the market share elements, and statistically, some of those team environments and what it could be. But again, maybe it's just at the pure top line. But is there a real easy, simplistic way for Tim to rebound and receive that scoring bump? Is it just to ignore 2024 and just go, no, that's not normative? The narrative is probably not the peak of 23. It's somewhere in between the two, which was what he's been at the Giants beforehand as well. Like, what's the pathway to at least some, if not a complete scoring pickup for a Tim Taranto?
Yeah, look, I think there's a way that a few ways you look at it. One is the team perspective, right? Like, and even just like, I'm just going to give you some stats. Like, sure, 1395 as a team average was so low, it hasn't been seen since Gold Coast entered the comp. I think it's gone around a bit, except for West Coast last year as well, who went 1361. So this team just became a heck of a lot part of the score. And there's actually an 82 point per game gap between 17th, which is Richmond, and then 16th, which is Collingwood. Like, it's outlier type stuff. League average without Richmond and West Coast baked into it actually goes from 1523 to 1541. It's a decent size change that we look at. Like, the statistician part of me looks at this stuff and goes, it's actually just super unlikely that teams score this poorly. And so when I look at that, just from an idea of just going, is this actually a probable outcome? Because, look, let's be honest, sport is sport. You can't predict things perfectly. No one can. And if AFL Fantasy Coach who thinks that they know the average for Taranto next year is dreaming. But then we have to bank on probabilities. What's most likely? What's going to happen? And so the likelihood that Richmond gets worse feels really improbable to me. Other people may disagree. People who read the narrative, but I kind of feel like that's improbable. And the probability that they increase, even if it's just by 20, 30 points a game, I feel like that's in the realm of probable. And so if we see team bump, if we see team improvement, then that's an avenue for Taranto to improve. So that's one element of it as well. The other thing is just going, well, if we talk about market share, we talk about who Taranto is as a player and in terms of what he commands in terms of a team. Well, I think Taranto fits this category of point creator. He's the one that goes for the ball. Like, if we look at Richmond, let's not think league-wide. Let's just think in terms of a team. He's fourth on the team for handball receives. People are looking for him. People are looking for him to have the ball. He's fifth on the team for meters gained. That's with Shea Bolton and Daniel Rioli. So he's third on the team for meters gained. So he's pushing the ball down the field. That's what Richmond would want. They want to see that continue. He's still first for CBAs, first for total clearances, first for tackles, first for contested possessions, first for total possessions, second for ground ball gets, second for hard ball gets, first for loose ball gets. Like, if there's anyone that the Tigers are going to say, all right, we need you to step up. We need you to lead these young guys. We need you to be the one with the ball in hand. Well, I think they look to Taranto. And that wasn't necessarily the case last year. You've got this absence of leadership. You know, Dusty's gone and Jack Graham's gone. You've got these guys who are, you know, the stalwarts of the club. They've left. And your distributor of halfback, you know, Danarell is gone. Your key half forward, so he's gone. And so suddenly you've got this absence of talent and it needs to go somewhere. You would argue that. And who are they going to look to? I think that's the key question. Whether it's just basic leadership or whether it is on field, how are we going to get the ball forward? Well, I think Tim Taranto is a guy that they would lean upon. And yeah, maybe like if we think about these great fantasy scorers of the past, then their situation, well, it's pretty similar to some of them.
You go back to the Jack Steele when St Kilda were statistically at the bottom of themselves, and Adelaide Crows of a Rory Laird of 2020, 21 and shades of 2022. Gosh, even going back a decade ago, a Tom Rockcliffe at Brisbane, Touk Miller at the Gold Coast Suns. These are similar types of players to what Tim Taranto is, which is high clearance, high ball winner, stoppage, repeat effort, pretty good runner, finds a way to win contest and uncontested possessions in a team and in a midfield that desperately needs someone to put them on their shoulders to protect them while they're developing and rediscovering a new midfield mix. So there's a lot of threads that you can go, Taranto looks a bit like Steele. He looks a little bit like Rockcliffe. He looks a little bit like Laird. He looks a little bit like Miller. And all of a sudden, you've pointed out statistically where he's already at the top of his line within the club, let alone now a team that has clearly allowed some of their premiership heroes to dissipate. Now something has to shift a little bit because Dusty had a 22% CBA share. He 51 total for the year. Liam Baker attended 175 centre bounces last year. Jack Graham, 144. And Shai Bolton's, like, he had a 54% centre bounce attendance rate last year, like over 300. So there's a lot of ball and centre bounce out the door. Lawler and Smiley are the kids that they've got at the draft. The others are more key position guys, and another isn't playing in the first half, if not the entirety of the season anyway. So they've gone heavy on key position drafts outside of the top 10 picks. And then I look at the other midfielders, and I'm keen on your thoughts around this midfield mix. I'm not sure Thompson Dow is a better version than what any of these kids are coming through. I know Prestia and Hopper are warriors in terms of how they just keep trying to get up, but both their body consistently is letting them down. And Kane McAuliffe, I think, adds a nice defensive element, but isn't he doesn't add anything different that a Taranto doesn't in terms of he's not a speed type of guy. The contest element Taranto's got, it's not the defensive pressure. It's not like he's a new dynamic piece to this midfield. And so I look at this side, and I remember talking to Dylan Alexander when we did a 10 Most Relevant Rookies episode in December, again, available on the channel. It feels like a really problematic midfield. They'll fix that at the draft over the next 2 years. But from a fantasy perspective for us this year, you're talking about pathways, threads, trends to become the Steele, the Rockcliffe, the Laird, the Miller, where they were 120 territory seasons. Timmy Taranto could be.
Yeah, I reckon it's 100% in the realm of possibility. And I think that's the thing with this narrative. There is no one. There's just no one we're looking at to go, yeah, they're going to be better than Tim Taranto in this team. And that's the exciting part. That's the really exciting part. I think one of the things I've looked at with a lot of those guys that you mentioned, the Rockcliffes, the Laird, Ablett, Miller, a lot of these guys were in teams that were actually poor scoring teams, but just not as poor as Richmond. They were scoring in that 1,400 to 1,470 kind of type range. And so there's an improvement in team-wise compared to what Richmond have been. And so I think there is an element of going, okay, we need this. We need this push. We need this push to be able to say that Taranto's going to get some support. And so the counter narrative, I reckon, to the well, this is the year for Taranto as the absolute number one. It's like, well, what if the handball receives drop-offs because no one else is actually getting enough handballs to him? What's it looking like at that coalface? Are we going to see an injured Hopper, an injured Prestia, to mean that actually it's just Taranto and Taranto is going to work his guts out, but it's just not going to be enough? And so you look at that, and I think in terms of market share, we're looking at what the possibilities are. Like an 8% market share is huge. Like that's near the top of what we've seen in the past. Rockcliffe in 2016, when he did 122, was 8.2%. Laird in 22, he was 8.2% when he did 120. Mitchell in 18, he was 8% when he did 128. Like that's those massive numbers. And so if this team just can't supply Taranto with enough points all round, then you're asking him to hit a market share that is potentially historical. And so that's the danger here. But the pathway is there. And I'm not a big narrative guy in terms of listening to what the preseason media is throwing at me. But look, in my research for Taranto, I was looking at this interview that Richmond did with him 5 days ago. And he's like, there's a lot of energy around the club and he gets to be the leader now and he's excited for that. I'm like, yeah, that's pretty exciting. But you never actually know what a whole bunch of rookies are going to inject into a club that was probably feeling at its lowest last year when Martin and Graham, all these guys, like they just couldn't do it anymore. And so I think when you look at that, maybe a new injection of energy is exactly what they need to just push that team points per game up another 50 points. But also they're young guys. They want to develop them. Maybe they're going to hold the ball in that back line a little bit more and Taranto floats back, gets some easy marks and is the one to kind of direct and say, Layla, Smiley, head here, get to this point. This is where we're going. And he actually gets to be the leader in that sense. So I think there is avenue and there is narrative to be able to say that actually this team could push 1450. That is possible.
That's so true. Jacob Hopper and Prestia have been, again, really good pieces. Like the Tigers don't win premierships without a Dion Prestia in that midfield. He was so important a piece to this premiership era for them. And then Jacob Hopper was alongside Taranto, the great hope to rebuild this midfield on the run. And you talk about what this mix of split of who's going to get centre-bounce presence and how that's all going to work. And if Hopper comes, that helps, right? Well, over the last 2 years, the pure data would say that's not the case. Now, there are injury-impacted games on the information I'm about to share on both sides of the coin, so it might level itself out. But in 2024, there was 10 games that they played, 5 games they played without each other. In the 10 games he played with Hopper in fantasy, he goes at just an 87.1, but he goes at 112.4 in fantasy last year. 25 points per game difference. SuperCoach, he goes 85 with Hopper, 112 without him, 27 points per game jump. And it's comparable in 2023 too. So it's not just cherry picking a half dozen games here. 16 games with him, he goes at 106 average in fantasy. So still pretty darn good on what we're paying for him right now, by the way. But it's up at a 126 in fantasy. So 19.6 points per game in fantasy, while in SuperCoach, it's a 20.6 points per game jump, up from 100.4 to a 121 flat. So there is this world where I'm fascinated to see how this Richmond midfield mix is. Does Prestia get on the park? Does he not? Can Hopper finally deliver the season that we'd all have longed for in the fantasy community, let alone for the Tigers, where he just becomes the Patrick Dangerfield clone we all hoped that he would one day be, but now he just might be an inside bull and not much more. So to me, it's a fascinating look because as you've mapped out beautifully for us throughout this episode, there's a world where if someone said to me, Tim Taranto's going 110 at the end of the year, I'd go, and across formats, there's a part of me that would go, I see it, I believe it, I get it. And if there was a part of me that just was like, there just wasn't the volume of opportunity through others taking it on or through the way Richmond moved the ball, geez, I could see him struggling to just get to 100 marker and be an okay starting squad selection. Geez, the outcome options here could be huge for Tim.
Yeah, big time. And that's the big question. I honestly probably don't have a real good answer for you about the Hopper situation. I think with any statistical reality or anything that we observe in data. Sometimes there's really clear reasons, sometimes there's not. It would point to if Hopper's in the team, then it's poor for Taranto. And I think you can believe that and you can roll with that and think that's fine. But you can also look at it and go, well, actually, does Hopper help the team? And does Hopper being in help the team? Does that help Taranto? And I think that's the question that I have in my mind. I probably need to look a little bit further into it, to be honest with you. But I think that's a big question for me. In a world where you've lost these, like we said, these stalwarts of the club, when they've gone, well, Hopper then maybe he feels a bit of that gap for those players that have gone, and Taranto still is able to elevate. So there's a conversation to be had around that, I guess, as well. But for me, yeah, it's definitely it's one thing in the negative column for Taranto if Hopper stays healthy. And I guess that's another thing. Are you going to bank on Hopper staying healthy for a full season, which he just hasn't done?
Probably the same for Tim too. For the better part of his career, it's been sometimes in the teens, the occasional 20-plus game there. But again, he's priced at a range for us that super coaches are now adapting to the volume of trades you've got, where he no longer has to be that 110 value premium that you keep for the season. He's the kind of guy you can run to the mid-season buy. Richmond don't have any of those early season buys. And if he's not doing what you need, you can trade him out at the buys if he's close enough but not enough, and you can pick someone that might have a favourable fixture, an injury dynamic changes, and away you go. You push him to the bench or your flex spot in Supercoach and Dream Team. There's so much that can happen here. There is a world with Tim Taranto that those elements of absence of stars, that he becomes the player that everything funnels through. That even with a fit Prestia and Hopper, he still has to be that number one guy in so many of the areas that Rowan has mapped out for us. And if he stays healthy and he stays in that space, I just don't see how he doesn't go 105 in fantasy. I just don't see it, making him a valuable enough pick to start. While in Supercoach, you might say his disposal efficiency hurts him. I'd remind you that halfway through 2023, at that buy, he was going 119. And that was in a team that even then was struggling to win games and not having a great share of points. And so to just rule him out because he at times isn't the cleanest user of the ball just might be ruling yourself out of a guy that has 105 potential that really can get on a run and go 110, 115, 120 if all the variables go your way. Could he be one of the most relevant midfielders? Absolutely. And it's in these moments, and we'll hit drafts in a sec, that it's a great reminder, the 50 most relevant outside of being a subjective list. It's all the formats thrown in together. We take Supercoach out of the mix, he probably bumps up 5, 10, 15 rank spots in this 50 because of how relevant he could be and how just appetizing a selection he could be. And then, Rowan, you take AFL Fantasy and Dream Team out, and it's a Supercoach only list, and now it's like, well, yeah, the 30s feels right for him. So this is the beautiful part of what it is for the community, is there's so much value to pick this year. There's so much. It's almost like, well, where do you want to scape it? Where do you want to shape it? And then from there, pick who you like.
Yeah, definitely. It's balls up in the air. One last stat I'll throw at you.
Please.
You mentioned games played. Well, in the years that he's gone, 23 games in 2023, 24 games in 2021, 26 games in 2019, averages of 112, 106.5 and 111. So maybe that's it. Healthy Taranto. That's all we're looking for.
That's all we need. Well, fingers crossed, toes crossed, especially for those that want to start him in 2025. A bit of health for Timmy T, and you might just have yourself a top line or near top line premium mid. Where he goes on a draft is always of great interest to me. And here at the Coaches Panel, we choose to draft on the Keeper platform. It's got unrivaled customization. But wherever you're drafting, we know Tim's going to be a dilemma point for somebody because he's got the potential M1 upside in AFL Fantasy. He's got the potential upside of M2 in Supercoach. But I don't think you have to pay for him, Rowan, on draft day at that. If you look at him by average of 2024, he's 36. in SuperCoach. He's 24 in fantasy. That puts him an M4 spot in SuperCoach and a M3 spot in fantasy. Does that feel about the right spot to get him? And how early do you feel comfortable to reach to make sure you land him?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I like the upside. So I'm looking at him going, if he's my M2, I'm probably happy in AFL Fantasy, M3, then in SuperCoach. And like if you're pushing him further later on, then that seems really nice, but potentially you've sacrificed in other areas to be able to get those top end bids. So yeah, I think I'd be looking at that M2 and willing to reach a little bit. But again, you've got to see what your league's doing.
100%. I'm with you. M2 in fantasy, I'm happy to reach, especially if I've landed some other positional areas that I'm really comfortable with. And SuperCoach, again, probably an M3 is about as early as I'd happily go. Though, we'll see what happens on draft day. Mate, an absolute pleasure. You've done a great job on your debut episode. Where can people keep in touch with you across social media? I know you're doing a lot of work in the market share space at the moment, but where can people keep in touch with you if they want to find out more?
Yeah, I'm on X, and you can find me at Rowan, TAFM, Rowan, the AFL Fantasy Marketplace. So it's where I put, doing a lot of the team previews and reports from last year and having a look at, how were these points divvied up? How do these teams go? What can we expect with the incoming players as well? So hopefully people are finding those threads interesting. But yeah, it's that's where you can find me.
That's awesome. Hey, if you want to go check that out and you're like, it was Rowan at the what? We've put the link in the description of the episode just to make it simple and easy for you so you can go and check that out. Also in there, the details to get in touch with us across social media, join our Patreon, get some hands on some Coaches Panel merch and everything you need. It is in the description of this episode. You're about 30 seconds away from a clue to find out who's next in the 50 most relevant. But if you are enjoying this series and you haven't given us a 5-star rating and a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this, please make sure you do it. It's a small, simple thing that you do that makes a huge impact for us. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you can comment below and let me know, what do you think Taranto will average this year? Subscribe to the channel and give this one a little bit of a thumbs up like too. We'd greatly appreciate it. So we've talked a lot about value, not just on this episode, but really it is the buzzword of the preseason, value upside. But then we quickly come to the conversation of an abundance of cash. Got so much money. What do I do with it? And so we end up going, I know what I'll do. I'll anchor with a big D1 option. I'll spend my money there on someone that I just know will be there for me by the end of the year. And I've heard a lot of names thrown about, but I haven't heard this name thrown about. And I hear the reason for why they don't like it. But I think you might be missing something by not considering starting him. Who am I talking about? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 Most Relevant.